Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of source material. We're going to break down a profound sermon that unpacks, literally, the anatomy of a biblical miracle. We'll be looking at a very well-known story from the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. Now, whether you're a biblical scholar or just someone who loves a good story about human desperation colliding with something totally unexplainable, you're going to find some incredible insights here. We're going to map out exactly how a miracle actually unfolds, not just as some supernatural event, but as a deeply psychological, deeply spiritual journey.
Okay, let's dive right into this. So, the sermon kicks off with this incredibly striking hook that frames the whole human condition. It points out a pretty hard truth, Everyone living in this world carries heavy burdens. And living a life completely without regrets? Yeah, that's practically impossible. But the source material notes something super interesting. It says that finding someone who can solve life's deepest problems, the regrets, the sorrows, purely by relying on faith, specifically the word of Jesus, is as rare as a protected natural monument. I mean, just think about that for a second. An endangered natural monument. It's such a beautiful, thought-provoking way to describe just how scarce true, unshakable trust really is when we're faced with an absolute crisis.
So, to understand exactly why that level of faith is so incredibly rare, we need to look at the historical context, the miracle of Cana, and a father's desperate journey.
This journey perfectly lays out the chronological arc of how this whole thing happens. We're looking at Jesus' second sign in Galilee, right after that famous moment of turning water into wine. So Jesus is back in Cana, but the vibe is completely different this time. We are dealing with a literal life-and-death situation. There's this royal official, a guy with serious wealth and status from Capernaum, who travels all the way to Cana with a desperate plea. He is begging Jesus to come down and heal his dying boy. But plot twist, he's actually met with what sounds like a pretty harsh rebuke. Still, driven by a father's love, he just pushes right through it with a persistent ask. And that leads to a definitive command from Jesus, and ultimately, the realization of the miracle. The crazy thing about this specific event, structurally speaking, is that Jesus never actually visits the patient. The entire healing unfolds from miles away, driven strictly by a spoken word.
Now, we really need to focus on that moment of rebuke. When the official first begs for help, Jesus responds with this major challenge. Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. The sermon uses this exact quote to set up the central tension of the entire story. And what is that tension? It's human doubt. Jesus isn't just talking to this one desperate dad here, he's addressing the underlying spiritual condition of the whole crowd around him. He's calling out that deeply flawed human tendency we all have, the need to see a spectacular visible show just to validate our faith.
To really wrap our heads around this tension, the sermon dives into the spiritual backdrop of the area. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is described as the light of Galilee, basically a spiritual light meant to save humanity. But here's the irony. The locals pretty much rejected this light. Why? Well, it came down to hometown bias and just superficial curiosity. They looked at Jesus and, they just saw a local guy from a humble, impoverished town. They figured no way a holy prophet is coming from our own backyard. Outwardly, sure, they welcomed him, but inwardly, there was absolutely no real reverence. They basically just wanted to see a magic trick. They wanted a spectacle based on all the rumors they'd heard about his miracles down in Jerusalem.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast this creates. On one hand, you've got the flawed, totally superficial faith of the Galilean locals, and on the other, you have the profound, desperate trust of this royal official. The locals? They require visible signs, they're blinded by their own hometown prejudice, and their interest is purely, entirely curious. But meanwhile, the official is fundamentally humble. He becomes completely reliant on a spoken word rather than needing a physical visit, which shows a faith that is truly borderless. It doesn't require Jesus to actually be in the physical room back in Capernaum to believe his power is going to work.
So this brings us to a super compelling question, and it pivots us straight from the historical story right into how we actually apply this text. In a world that's just full of superficiality, deep personal crises, and what the sermon calls spiritual darkness, how do we actually find the light? How do we become that rare, protected natural monument of faith we talked about earlier? Well, to answer that, the sermon pulls out a really powerful solution. It breaks it down into 3 core theological pillars that literally anyone can apply when their back is against the wall.
Let's see how this builds as we look at the first step. Pillar 1, the power of humility. The source text argues that the absolute first step to finding the light during times of severe suffering is offering a genuinely humble prayer. Reaching out to something greater than ourselves requires completely dropping our ego.
And the sermon visualizes this humility brilliantly using a very simple number, 7 to 10. That is the estimated number of grueling hours this high-ranking royal official walked, on foot, from Capernaum to Cana. I mean, just think about the extreme loss of pride it took for this guy. He was a wealthy, powerful figure with immense authority. He could have sent a dozen servants. He could have tried to use the law to summon Jesus. But instead, he lays down his status completely, sweating and walking for up to 10 hours just to personally beg a young, unconnected carpenter for help. That physical, exhausting journey, it's the ultimate manifestation of true humility.
And once that humility is established, we arrive at the next step, Pillar 2, a generous Almighty.
The sermon explains that God actually responds to this fragile human effort with incredible generosity, even when the faith itself isn't totally perfect yet. Look, when the Furna official first asked Jesus to physically come down to his house, he was technically limiting divine power to a specific physical location, right? But Jesus didn't turn him away. To explain why we constantly doubt this generosity, the sermon uses an absolutely brilliant metaphor. It compares our human doubt to a creditor who verbally promises to forgive a massive debt, but the debtor absolutely refuses to believe it until they see the legally signed, stamped paperwork. It perfectly represents our unbelief and our desperate need for tangible proof. We naturally want to limit divine power to what we can see, touch, and measure in physical space. We demand the paperwork, but the sermon is actively challenging us to just accept the verbal forgiveness without demanding to see the receipt.
Which flows perfectly into our final step, Pillar 3, the Word as Presence.
This right here is the ultimate climax of the sermon's message. It asks the listener to grasp a deeply profound theological concept, that the spoken word itself carries the very presence of God. You don't actually need the physical manifestation if you have the word. And here is the climactic resolution. Jesus looks at this desperate, exhausted father and simply says, "Go, your son will live." He doesn't go with him. He literally just gives him the word. And what does the official do? He turns right around and starts that 7 to 10-hour walk back home. He believes the word without any immediate visible evidence that his son is actually healed. No proof. This incredible moment proves that spiritual accompaniment exists even when physical proof is nowhere to be found. The very second he believed the word, the miracle was already in motion.
So, what does this all mean for us? What do we actually take away from all of this? Well, the sermon concludes by summing up the overarching benefits of relying on this kind of faith rather than just leaning on worldly methods to solve our deepest struggles. When we rely on the word, the text argues we get dual benefits. There are physical benefits, like navigating our earthly, everyday struggles with more grace, and profound spiritual benefits. But more importantly, unlike purely secular problem solving, relying on faith preserves our connection to eternal values. It keeps us anchored in the bigger picture, in the concepts of resurrection and ultimate salvation.
It's just a masterful breakdown of how a miracle functions, not just as some historical event, but as a total shift in human perspective. And it leaves us with this final, really provocative question to reflect on. When you are faced with a massive crisis in your own life, do you demand the paperwork? Do you demand visible proof and signs? Or, like the official walking back to Capernaum in the pitch dark, do you have the humility to simply trust the word? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this breakdown provided you with a clear, structured, and totally new way to look at this fascinating piece of history. Catch you next time.